The elastic face, the rubbery limbs, the effortless physical comedy that made generations laugh. Dick Van Dyke has spent nearly a century building a legacy as one of entertainment's most beloved figures. For audiences, he has always embodied the quintessential nice guy, warm, charming, endlessly optimistic. His megawatt smile seemed as natural off-screen as on, and his ability to make pratfalls and dance routines appear weightless turned him into a cultural treasure. But now, at 98 and having worked for over 8 decades, Van Dyke has started to give us peeks of a less cheerful reality beneath the bright, sunny exterior. The fellow who danced atop rooftops as Bert the Chimney Sweep in Mary Poppins and tumbled around ottomans as Rob Petrie on the Dick Van Dyke show wasn't always as sunny once cameras ceased rolling. Like any true artist, Van Dyke had deeply held convictions about his craft, and when those convictions were challenged by critics, colleagues, or studio executives, the smile sometimes faded. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. These moments were never about ego or petty quarrels. Unlike the explosive feuds that dominate Hollywood gossip columns, Van Dyke's conflicts were subtler, rooted in his philosophy of comedy, professionalism, and artistic integrity. His own conviction was always that entertainment must uplift, not degrade, include, not exclude. But when others in his circle insisted on a different path, he found himself struggling with private frustrations. Today, looking back over a century of life, Van Dyke admits there were shadows behind the sunshine of his on-screen image, shadows of creative frustration and inner strain. Shadows that influenced his trajectory in ways viewers never imagined. Here are 6 tales, 6 figures, moments, and relationships that pushed the mettle of Dick Van Dyke's legendary good nature and unleashed the steely determination hidden behind the song and dance. Number 6, the critic he never forgot. For an artist whose career has lasted all but 8 decades, it would seem strange that one review would have such a long-lasting impact. However, in 1961, when the Dick Van Dyke Show was trying to get its footing in its inaugural season, the scathing dismissal of one critic was able to penetrate Van Dyke's usually unbreakable optimism. The critic, whose identity Van Dyke never publicly revealed, wrote that the young leading lady was too lightweight and ultimately forgettable, a pleasant performer lacking the substance to carry a series. To Van Dyke, who had struggled up from radio to the stage to the tube, the words stung particularly. They appeared to validate his worst fear, that his clean-style comedy could be perceived as superficial or not hip enough. One writer on the show remembered later, "We were still getting our sea legs, the ratings weren't good, and Dick was putting himself under incredible pressure." That review just devastated him. It wasn't even criticism. It was someone telling him he didn't have what it takes. While the Dick Van Dyke Show would go on to be celebrated as one of the finest accomplishments of television, Van Dyke acknowledged in his memoir, My Lucky Life in and Out of Show Business, that he never forgot that one critique. Years afterward, he admitted, "I've forgotten most of the bad and good reviews, but that one lingered." Even in the 1990s, when the critic's name came up at a function, Van Dyke, usually the ultimate graciousness, let a glint of steel appear, saying drolly, "Well, I guess we disproved him, didn't we?" That was a telling moment about Van Dyke's personality. Underneath the smile was a serious man who was deeply concerned about his legacy. His decision to ground comedy in warmth, accessibility, and honesty was intentional, and being told it was a flaw was a blow at his very identity. Number 5. Walter Matthau, When Temperaments Collide. In 1964, Van Dyke came back to the Los Angeles stage for a short-run comedy opposite Walter Matthau. On paper, a dream combination. Van Dyke's irrepressible optimism and bubbly energy, Matthau's cynical, world-tired humor. In practice, a war of temperament that laid bare Van Dyke's limits of patience. From the first rehearsal, their incompatibility was clear. Van Dyke showed up early, learned everyone's names, and exuded energy. Matthau would stroll in late, complain about the script, and improvise outlandishly. A stage manager remembered, They were like men from different planets. Dick was disciplined and prepared. Walter was unpredictable and sarcastic. Both great, but entirely incompatible. Van Dyke grew exasperated with Mathau's incessant improvisations because they upset the meticulous flow of his own comedy. Walter is brilliant and draining, Van Dyke confided to a fellow actor backstage. I never know if we're doing what we've rehearsed or something entirely new. The turning point occurred on a key comedic scene. Mathau continually shifted the way he was delivering the lines, and it was impossible for Van Dyke to get into the pace he required. For normally even-tempered Van Dyke, asking the director to step in was tantamount to another actor pitching a chair. Although the show was a success and critics complimented their complementary styles, the two never again collaborated. The experience served to reinforce what Van Dyke previously understood. Comedy was most effective when founded upon trust, reliability, and cooperation, never pandemonium. Number 4. CBS executives fighting for a show's survival. Today, The Dick Van Dyke Show is hailed as one of the finest sitcoms ever created. But back in 1961, CBS executives were less than convinced. Ratings were moderate, and the show's upscale, character-oriented wit didn't fit into the wide, flat, slapstick style of the time. Executives pressured creator Carl Reiner and Van Dyke to make it more relatable. They wanted bigger gags, dumber jokes, and even suggested Van Dyke adopt a catchphrase to repeat every episode. Van Dyke, horrified, refused. That would undermine everything we're trying to do, he said firmly in one tense meeting. As ratings languished, cancellation threatened. The network insisted on format changes as the price of renewal. To all surprised, Van Dyke, a young man still building his career with a family to feed, announced he'd prefer quitting to sacrificing the show's integrity. I'd prefer being unemployed than doing something I don't believe in, he stated. Finally, producer Sheldon Leonard persuaded CBS to allow the show more time. The risk paid off. The Dick Van Dyke Show lasted for 5 seasons, won 15 Emmys, and rewrote sitcom history. But the struggle left a scar. Van Dyke afterwards said, "They didn't believe in us until it was nearly too late. I've never forgotten how close we were to losing something truly precious." Number 3. Julie Andrews made up magic on the Mary Poppins set. There are few on-screen pairings as seemingly natural and pleasant as Dick Van Dyke and Julie Andrews in Disney's Mary Poppins. Their musical numbers emanated charm, as if the two actors had been best friends all their lives. But off-screen, the magic was made up, not real. Andrews, classically trained in voice and British theater tradition, was a perfectionist with flawless technique. Van Dyke, self-trained and intuitive, used physicality and improvisation. Their styles conflicted subtly. Andrews was sometimes discomforted by Van Dyke's lack of discipline, and he was sometimes intimidated by her flawless control. I remember Dick making a joke that Julie was practically perfect in every way like Mary Poppins, said an assistant choreographer. He laughed, but you could see her perfection making him a little self-conscious. Another undercurrent of tension was Disney's assigning Van Dyke 2 roles, Bert and the Old Banker, while assigning the lead role to Andrews alone. Some felt that Andrews felt hemmed in, although she never mentioned it in public. In spite of these differences, both were consummate professionals. Director Robert Stevenson even shot their pivotal scenes first, lest tension develop later. On screen, the illusion of easy camaraderie was perfect. Off-screen, they had respect, but never developed the same kind of closeness fans imagined. Years later, Van Dyke tactfully clarified, "Julie is amazing. We had 2 different ways of doing it, but we both desired the same enchanting outcome." His statement indicates his professionalism, his assumption that the audience's perception was more important than his own comfort. Number 2, Jim Carrey, A Generational Divide. By the 1990s, things were different. Along came Jim Carrey, rubber face, high-strung energy, and outrageous physicality. To some, Carrey was the destined successor to Van Dyke. But in private, Van Dyke wasn't so certain. Watching Carrey's movies, he was impressed by the talent, but was uncomfortable. "He's working too hard to be funny rather than just being funny," he explained to a friend. For Van Dyke, comedy had to be based on character and reality, not driven to extremes for the sake of shock. The rift solidified when the two were being considered for parts in the same movie. Van Dyke refused to participate, explaining that their approaches would be incompatible. It wasn't personal, he never met with Carey, but philosophical. "I always thought that you didn't have to hit the audience on the head to get them to laugh," he said. Ironically, both men had incredible physical talents and range. Carey later demonstrated his dramatic chops, and Van Dyke had exhibited flashes of wild energy in his own career. But they represented different comedy eras. Van Dyke's understated human-based approach versus Carey's hyper-expressiveness. The contrast demonstrated Van Dyke's long-standing credo: the greatest comedy arises out of truth and commonality, not overstatement for its own sake. Number 1. Carl Reiner, creative tension with a genius. Among all of Van Dyke's working relationships, none was greater or more complicated than his collaboration with Carl Reiner. Reiner conceived of the Dick Van Dyke Show and directed the course of Van Dyke's career, but their senses of comedy were not always one and the same. Reiner demanded realism, even danger. Van Dyke demanded honesty as well, but with more defined limits of taste. He felt comedy could be intelligent and clean without being edgy. This disparity emerged frequently in talks about scripts. They argued about references to liquor, with Reiner scripting Rob Petrie as a social drinker and Van Dyke resisting. They reached a middle ground. Rob drank periodically but never in excess. Likewise, Reiner occasionally wished to suggest more about Rob and Laura's bedroom life, while Van Dyke favored restraint.